making money-driven machines. My second point is going to be on where is the line drawn? External versus internal. False idea of organizations or corporations existing in a vacuum. This is the idea of where does the line draw between external pressures and internal pressures. We need to look at organizations as they exist in the real world. They do not exist by themselves. They have pressures coming from all sides. I like to paint a picture for you. So we're going to use the metaphor of a tree. We think of a tree as a business process, as a business in itself that grows and takes in everything. The tree does not exist by itself. The tree exists because we have oxygen from the atmosphere, we have sunshine, we have water, we have everything that goes into making that tree. So my question is then, where do we draw the line between the external part of the tree and the internal part of the tree? The tree grows and it adapts and takes in everything around it. So my point with the metaphor of the tree is that we need to view the organization as a whole in context in society from which is it possible to separate. It's very hard to distinguish where the pressures come from. Governmental pressures, governmental regulations, and internal pressures driven from the employees. When businesses make decisions, they take all of these factors into account. Organizations as an entity in themselves cannot exist apart from society as a whole. Also, businesses exist to provide society with solutions. The way they do this is by consulting with all stakeholders and all shareholders. Wouldn't you agree?
I don't agree. So do you not agree that all companies would not invest in greener machinery and greener ways of extracting oil if there was no pressure from governments? That's what's in question.
That's a good point, and pressure from governments being inside. But we have to think about who are the main drivers of change in the organization. It is not governments imposing regulations or rules, but it is the employees in themselves and in the corporations. Think of an employee that works for the oil company. This employee would be somebody who's informed, somebody who's read National Geographic, somebody who knows about the scary images posted by environmental groups. These employees would not feel comfortable working for an organization that embodies these roles, that embodies this philosophy. Change is driven within the organization. Pressure is put on by ordinary people on their governments and ordinary people that work for the corporations themselves. So this is not a mutually exclusive idea. So what we're saying in the end is that the proposition is not completely wrong in itself, but it has a long way from telling the whole story. Instead, what we would say is that meaningful action and sustainability can only be achieved if individuals, employees, governments, business, and civil society work together and maintain pressure on each other. And for these reasons, this proposal must be opposed. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, honorable judges, worthy opponents, thank you so much for being here today. We're all really excited to be here and debate this topic today. And once again, I'll state that the motion before us is, without outside pressure, corporations will not take meaningful action on sustainability. Now, I'd first like to point out that what the member of the opposition said about us calling corporations evil, that's absolutely not what we're talking about here today. What we're talking about is getting corporations to think in a both sustainable and business profitable way. And unfortunately, we believe that that can only be done with government intervention and government outside pressure. I'm going to talk mainly about the inability of these corporations to take action out of their own will, give a brief overview of carbon emissions and what's going on with the earth and so forth, and discussions on why we need standards to be set now by the government. Our last speaker will handle most of the rebuttal in this debate. I will talk a little bit more about our constructive ideas for why these need to be set into place. The oil industry is a crucial example that we wanted to talk about today because there are a large group of corporations doing harm to the environment. The opportunity for environmental technology to be brought into this industry is feasible. Unfortunately, that without this outside pressure, these companies are not acting to bring in this technology. So we feel what matters is that they are going to get fired unless they do the best that they can for their corporation at this time. And I'd like to bring in my first example, which is economist Milton Friedman. In 1995, he released an economic report on what he believed was that social responsibility of corporations was strictly profits, and that to do anything to hurt those profits or damage your bottom line was irresponsible for a corporation, and that if we wanted to bring in environmental standards, that it had to be from outside pressures. Basically, in the short run, execs and employees of these companies need to protect their job. They need to protect what the company is about. That's the way it is, ladies and gentlemen. If these environmental standards need to be put in place, which we agree that they do not understand, thank you very much, and I do not think that the other side will agree with me, disagree with me, excuse me, that carbon emissions need to be lowered, we have to be done by government putting in standards. Now, one of the biggest problems we see against this is that, especially the oil companies we brought up earlier as an example, is lobbying very heavily against the government to stop these standards being put in place. And my next example is that in 2001, the United States pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol. And a lot of that was speculated because George Bush made a statement saying that it was too expensive to lower their carbon emissions to the level that was required. And he was also from Texas, one of the greatest oil refining and excavating places in the world. So without this government intervention, it is going to be difficult. We never said it would be difficult for this government to put in these standards and taxes. But it needs to be done, ladies and gentlemen. It's the only way that competitive industries, such as the oil industry, can be successful without losing money. Sorry, not at this time. Thank you very much. So the implication is that a lot of companies are giving off the impression of being sustainable, specifically environmentally sustainable, but they are not actually living up to meaningful actions on sustainability, which my first people talked a bit about more of what is meaningful. Now, the oil industry's 60% of their emissions are atmospheric, which are, which are contributing very heavily to global warming. And these effects, obviously, I know lots of you know a lot about global warming. These effects are irreversible. And something needs to be done, and something needs to be done now. The government has to start implementing meaningful standards and taxes to lower the emissions of organizations and corporations such as the oil industry. I'd like to, my last example, bring up South Africa, the Calix oil refinery in South Africa. They've done a lot of studies showing the effects between the ill health of people there and the oil refinery taking place. Now, they have a voluntary pact signed with this oil refinery to lower their carbon emissions. However, they're not living up to these standards because they are not enforceable and the government has not yet moved in. But they are being asked by the people of South Africa to move in and have the government put in these standards, which is the only way that they will lower these and get them to a point where people can enjoy a higher quality of life. So, side proposition has shown that it is in the best interest of these corporations to be environmentally sustainable. We completely agree with that. However, the only way that can be done is by government standards. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone, and once again, thank you for joining us today. I would first like to build on the opposition's second point, followed by a rebuttal that was brought forward. So, first of all, Mahatma Gandhi once said, "You must be the change you want to see in the world." This used to be a counter-argument towards business. However, nowadays, we all know as consumers, as the driving forces for demand for businesses, that we are creating demand for a greener economy, for a more sustainable way of doing business practices. Therefore, organizations are doing just that. They are being able to cater to our demands, to their employers' demands, their executives, suppliers, any form of client. We all want this change to take place. Therefore, the demand is already there. Now, whether it be one executive or the very most entry-level position, if this is in place in an organization already, which is an ecosystem,